This video was originally meant to be a video exploring the DPS impact of the switch from crit hit damage to crit hit chance on SMGs, but as I continued to math out a variety of solutions with regards to this, I kept circling back to the larger and more interesting question, which is now, with the change to stat distributions and budgets in patch 1.6, what is the absolute best DPS configuration available for those looking to build for maximum DPS? So we're going to answer both of those questions in this video. We're going to understand the true impact of the change to SMGs, and we're also going to do a best-in-slot DPS guide for both SMGs and Assault Rifles. Sound good? I thought so. Let's begin. So to begin, I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about the methodology for this exercise, since understanding how all of this works is actually quite important. If you're not interested in that detail, however, then just skip ahead to the timestamp in the description below, and you can see all the outputs there. Now, the tools for this exercise didn't exist in an updated form, and that is a reliable DPS calculator that could calculate PVE and PVP DPS in the new 1.6 world. So I went ahead and built those tools, or more specifically rather, I refreshed them. See, some time ago I built a DPS formula calculation spreadsheet that allowed me to model DPS in the game fairly accurately, but there were some differences between it and the live game because they had some funky ways of calculating on-sheet DPS. Now, I actually worked directly with the development team at Massive when they were refreshing the DPS calculation going into patch 1.4. And what they actually did was they took the calculation that I used in my DPS spreadsheet and then they dropped that into the game. So the calculation that you're using now is exactly the same calculation that you'll see in this spreadsheet, so it should give you a largely accurate view versus what you see in the game, except for a few funky things where they do some strange stuff with gear sets and a few multiplicative factors and some other stuff which really doesn't have a big impact on the overall result. Now, more recently, I've made two major changes to this spreadsheet. Number one, it now uses an additive formula for the calculation of critical headshots instead of a multiplicative calculation, as this change went in a few patches ago. And secondly, it now includes a PvP damage calculation that includes the 35% base armor, which is what most people are going to be running around with unless they have bonus armor from gear talents, as well as the PvP enemy armor damage calculation, which basically takes 1/3 of your enemy armor damage and uses that to reduce enemy armor in PvP. Now, this is very different to the way it's calculated on the PvE side of the game, and I calculate that differently there because I essentially just cut that value in half by 50%. Since enemies generally have about 50% of their health is armor and the other 50% of it is their health bar. It's a little bit less than that, but doesn't matter, we'll just round it down. And that's that. So that's the way that I handle armor calculations on both the PvP side as well as the PvE side. Now, to be really clear, this spreadsheet also calculates both sustained DPS as well as burst DPS. Now, sustained DPS essentially factors in your reload time, and it looks to average out your DPS over the time it takes to empty your magazine and then to reload it. Where burst DPS is really about how much damage you are dealing without factoring reloading into the equation, which is really important in PvP since you basically just want to put your target down fast without ever having to reload. The other critical tool in this process is a view of gear and stat budgets in patch 1.6, and for this I relied, as always, on the exceptional work of Spyder. He's a data miner who has consistently provided first-class information to the community. A huge thanks to him for all his work, and you'll find a link to his data mine outputs in the description below. So with these tools in hand, we can essentially build imaginary characters by picking and choosing stats, weapons, mods, etc., summing up all of these values and then basically plugging those values into the DPS calculation spreadsheet to see what is the best configuration per weapon type. For this video, I'm going to be looking exclusively at SMGs and Assault Rifles because, long story short, these weapons provide the best overall DPS for the way that most players are playing the game. Sure, if you have amazing headshot accuracy and you can sit back with a sniper rifle, you will achieve more DPS than what we're talking about here. And similarly, LMGs have some truly amazing sustained DPS because they have very large magazines and you very rarely have to reload them. And shotguns can also be really strong in terms of burst damage, but their range and sustained damage is really terrible. These weapons are a lot more situational and far less versatile than the assault rifle and the SMG, and for that reason I focus this analysis on those. I will be doing other videos on those in the future, so do watch out for them. I've also removed headshot damage from these calculations since headshot accuracy is impossible to accurately predict and really corrupts the data outputs. Regardless, assault rifles have a higher headshot damage modifier than SMGs, but SMGs are much more stable and accurate. So in my view, these things really cancel each other out. So excluding them from the analysis is certainly the best course of action. I've also only included 2 weapon talents in this analysis, which are Deadly, granting 15% critical hit damage, and Destructive, which grants 15% enemy armor damage. Many other weapon talents provide far more situational DPS than these, but the combinations are limitless and would sort of make our baselining impossible. These 2 talents provide a good baseline from which to work, but you'll absolutely be able to choose better talents and achieve more DPS depending on which talent choices you make and the playstyle that you have. Finally, I'm not going to be talking about stacking firearms past the 4750 cap required for weapon talents. In fact, I'm actually not going to be talking about firearms at all. Basically, I think it's a bad decision in most instances to stack on huge amounts of firearms since it scales very poorly. In my view, you're actually far better off putting these excess stats into stamina and skill power to make your character more versatile and more sustainable. Obviously though, it must be said that the more firearms you stack on, the more damage you will do. That's obvious, but there isn't anything complicated about that calculation since it scales in a strictly linear fashion. Stack it on as high as you please, but be ready for the trade-off in survivability. Alright, so that's all the setup out the way. Let's get down to the results. So for the SMG, there are 2 that we're going to speak about today. It's the MP7 and the PP19. We look at both of these because they have vastly different damage profiles, with the MP7 being focused on rate of fire burst DPS, where the PP19 is very much focused on sustained damage with its slower rate of fire and much larger magazine. So I'm going to begin by answering the most important question, which is how much of a buff was the change from crit hit damage to crit hit chance on SMGs? And I'm going to answer it by saying that it wasn't a buff, it was a nerf. Now, for a long time, I've seen people all over the place asking for crit to come back to SMGs, but asking for this demonstrates a really fundamental misunderstanding of math and the relationship between crit hit chance and crit hit damage, as well as just not understanding the overall supply of these stats across gear. In essence, crit is only as good as the amount of critical hit damage you have available to you. And while we have heaps and heaps of ways to get crit, we actually have very few ways to stack the required critical hit damage to make that crit truly worthwhile. And we've just lost the best source of crit hit damage available to us, which was the crit hit damage native on SMGs. Now, if we look at an optimized DPS build in patch 1.5, and with a critical hit damage SMG, so one of the old ones, we end up doing less DPS than we did in patch 1.5, so we've actually gone backwards. Now the reason for this is that, patch 1.5 gave us greater access to enemy armor damage on our masks and knee pads, where now this is actually a major stat that most SMG users will probably be skipping, but I'll talk about that a little bit more later. However, if we got to keep our critical hit damage on our SMGs, then we'd actually be doing more DPS under an optimized build that is stacking as much critical hit damage as possible. It's a small difference, but an important one. So essentially what I'm saying is that if you left critical hit damage on SMGs going into patch 1.6, we would be dealing more damage with our SMGs. Now the reasons for this are really simple to understand. Here are all the sources of crit in the game, crit chance, right? And that totals 108%. But remember, we only have a 60% crit cap that we have to work with. We cannot exceed that under any circumstances. So going beyond that is a total waste of stats and it delivers no value. Here are all the sources of critical hit damage in the game, totaling 123%. Now, mathematically speaking, there is an optimal relationship of about 1% crit to 10% critical hit damage, right? And you can kind of test this yourself in the spreadsheet that I've built. All you need to do is actually up your crit chance by 1%, look at the damage, remove your crit chance, and then replace it with 10% critical hit damage. And you'll see that your DPS goes up by almost exactly the same amount, because that's the mathematical relationship that exists between those two stats. Now, given that we have a crit cap of 60% and we can hit it really easily, we would actually need access to 600 critical hit damage to be getting the full value out of our existing critical hit chance. In short, we didn't need more critical hit chance, we needed more critical hit damage. Now, under this model, given the 123% critical hit damage available to us across all sources throughout the game, we actually only need like 12% crit chance to be getting the maximum optimal value out of our crit chance. Anything beyond this point is still valuable, but it's actually hitting the diminishing returns territory, meaning that we aren't being as efficient as we could be with these stats. So, to be clear, this is technically a nerf to SMG power when it comes to raw DPS throughput, and we need to understand that because facts matter, and everyone right now is gushing about how the SMG has suddenly become stronger, and it simply hasn't. This is absolutely not true. They've always been good, it's just that the FAMAS alpha combo has been way better, and now that that's out of the picture, and because the SMGs are suddenly back on the menu for whatever reason, people are returning to them, and they're seeing that they're actually in a pretty strong state. And while we turn back to SMGs to realize their values, there's two very important talents that I would remind you about which are real game changers. Now, the first is Self-Preserved. It's a talent that heals you for a portion of your damage every time you crit. Now, this talent hasn't received any changes. The SMG is no more powerful, so it's not like this talent is any better. I just think it's a case of people are going to start using it now, and they're going to see that when they're trading against other people in PvP and they see all that extra healing coming to them, they're going to be like, hey, this is really handy. So guys, please take a look at Self-Preserved. You're going to see it's actually a very, very powerful talent. It always has been, and it continues to be in patch 1.6, where SMGs are more viable because assault rifles are not as attractive. The second talent that people are going to wake up and take notice of is Hurried. Now, Hurried reduces your reload time every time you crit to a minimum of 1 second, so it can't make you reload any faster than 1 second. So over the course of a standard SMG magazine, you'll almost always crit enough to reduce your reload speed to the minimum 1 second. It was a talent that was brought in patch 1.3 Underground, and it was initially restricted to just the PP19 since it had a very large magazine and you had to reload a lot less often. It wasn't a big deal. Now, this restriction was actually removed in patch 1.5, so all SMGs could roll this talent, but since SMGs were pretty much ignored during the reign of the uncomplicated Alpha Bridge, no one cared about this talent. But mark my words, in patch 1.6, Hurried is a big game changer. The MP7, for example, has some truly awful sustained DPS because its 1.9 second reload time is long compared to its time to dump its magazine. Now imagine dumping an MP7 into someone's face and then being able to reload that thing in a second. It's literally faster than changing to your secondary weapon at that point, since that takes about 1.2 seconds. Now on an MP7, Hurried alone equates to a sustained DPS increase of about 25%, which is absolutely huge. So don't overlook these two talents, Self-Preserved and Hurried. They've always been good, it's just that no one's been paying attention to them. Please pay attention to them now. So now that we know that SMGs aren't really any stronger in patch 1.6, we need to ask whether or not they're actually truly competitive in both PvE and PvP, and I'm very pleased to tell you that there was clearly some method to the madness of the developers when they went through this process, because the balance between assault rifles and SMGs is quite possibly the best it's ever been, and I'm going to show you that right now by comparing the PvE and PvP performances of the MP7, the PP19, and the mighty LVOAC. Now, for the purposes of this analysis, I'm just using basic weapon damage values as provided in the gear attribute cheat sheet. The values don't actually matter here. What matters is their relative values. So when I talk about absolute DPS, like the MP7 does 200k DPS, don't worry about that, right? Focus instead where I say that the MP7 does 10% more damage than the other weapon, right? That's the number you need to worry about. It's the percentage differences that you're focusing on, not the actual DPS numbers. Turning first to the SMG. To compare the SMG to the assault rifle, I first had to develop the maximum possible DPS configuration you can achieve, excluding any investment in headshot damage. So to do this, I looked at all stats available across gear and mods and weapon mods and pulse and the weapon itself, and both deadly and destructive weapon talents, the two talents I referred to earlier. After literally hours of trying different combinations, I eventually arrived at the following configuration for an SMG user in patch 1.6. Now this is the best possible combination of stats that you can select to maximize your damage, excluding things like, gear sets or the Skull MC gloves, since, that really creates a very different kind of discussion. For those of you looking to stack headshot damage in PvE, you'd essentially take this in every single slot, which basically is just on your weapon mod, since this is unquestionably the most DPS efficient stat you can take in PvE, since headshots are generally fairly easy to land land, except on consoles, where I know it is a lot harder. Setting headshot damage aside and returning to our earlier gear configuration, you'll notice that I've done everything I can to avoid crit pretty much everywhere, since it's so readily available from the SMG itself, from our pulse, from Savage, and from incidental values appearing on our critical hit damage focus weapon mods. Trying really hard to avoid crit wherever I could, I still hit the crit cap with great ease, allowing me to pour DPS stats into critical hit damage and enemy armor damage instead. Now, if we model the total DPS of this configuration on an MP7, we get the following values. You'll notice that the sustained DPS is way lower than the burst DPS on the MP7, but as I've said, the inclusion of the hurried talent does wonders for this and makes the weapon truly incredible in the PvE space as well. Here you can see the difference in DPS between a normal MP7 and one with the hurried talent. Now, if we apply the same DPS configuration to a PP19, we see some very big differences. The burst damage is way lower, but the sustain is much better even without hurried. Adding hurried to the mix adds even more sustained DPS to the weapon, making it an excellent talent even for the PP19. So now we have the PvE and PvP performance values of the best PvP and PvE SMGs in the game. Cool. The real question, and the one I'm sure you've no doubt been waiting for, is how does this compare to assault rifles? Well, first of all, we actually have to rejig our ideal stat distribution for assault rifles. There's two reasons for this. Firstly, they don't have base crit hit chance on them, so if we want to maximize our crit chance, we kind of need to move our stats around in order to do that. But here's where things get interesting. Enemy armor damage is an extremely powerful stat in PvP, so the question immediately becomes, in the case of assault rifles, is it better to go for the crit cap, or is it better to stack as much enemy armor damage as possible and then put the rest into, critical hit damage? And the answer is unquestionably to stack enemy armor damage as high as possible, because crit just doesn't hold a candle to enemy armor damage in PvP. And as we've already said, we're already so overloaded with our crit chance, and we just don't have enough critical hit damage to make it truly worthwhile. Now, for completeness sake, I've modeled both scenarios, one that focused on crit hit chance and another that focused on critical hit damage, and the results are clear. Critical hit damage beats it hands down. Therefore, the best DPS configuration for an assault rifle is to stack enemy armor damage as high as possible, and then put the rest into critical hit damage, and then put whatever is left into critical hit chance. And with this calculated, we can now compare the DPS of both configurations across all three weapons, and then we can look at their performance in various contexts. For PvE sustain, a PP19 with hurried is the clear winner, being about 6% stronger than the MP7 with hurried. The large magazine and speedy reload time make this thing a real bullet hose that doesn't spend a lot of time not firing. Lagging significantly behind in this category is the LVOAC, but we need to be clear about why that is. It's purely because hurried grants so much extra DPS throughput. It's a case of hurried being really strong here, rather than assault rifles being weak or even the SMG being strong. It's very much the talent that's propping up this result. Next, let's take a look at PvE burst damage. So here we remove the reload speed from the calculation and we simply ask how much DPS are these weapons doing while they are firing. That's it, right? And the results are actually really interesting. The MP7, a weapon generally considered to be the best burst DPS weapon in the game, is actually weaker than the LVOAC when it comes to PvE burst DPS. The reason for this is the way that enemy armor damage is calculated on the PvE side of the game. It basically just straight up multiplies your damage, meaning that it's one of the most efficient stats to stack at all times in PvE. The fact that the assault rifle has more enemy armor damage stacked here gives it an advantage, but it's a spread of only 5%, so we really shouldn't get too worked up about that. Next up, let's take a look at PvP sustain damage, and here I've applied the 0.42 damage modifier, which is what the developers landed on after lots of trial and error on the recent PTS, and we're also calculating the impact of enemy armor damage on the base 35% enemy armor that people bring into the last stand game mode, since this is where most PvP will be happening in a post 1.6 world. When looking at these results, we can see that even with the inclusion of the extra enemy armor damage on assault rifles, they still cannot compete with the raw sustained power of the PP19 with Hurried. The magazine is just too large and the reload is too short. If we removed Hurried from the equation, however, we can see that assault rifles are actually on par with the PP19 and well ahead of the MP7, which has notoriously low sustained damage in every context. Let's not read too much into this value though, because to be honest, we really care more about burst damage in PvP, so let's take a look at that now. So remember when I said that there was some method to the madness of the devs when they set about balancing these weapons, and they actually did a really good job of it? Well, behold, here we see that the LVOEC is better than the MP7 from a burst damage perspective in PvP, but only by a factor of about 7%. So the spread there is actually very, very small. And I think we should really look at these values and say that yes, SMGs and assault rifles are largely balanced in patch 1.6 from a DPS perspective at least. Now, I need to be very clear that this is only from a DPS perspective. What I haven't spoken about here is the very important consideration of optimal range. SMGs have roughly half the optimal range that an assault rifle does, and they drop off very hard, very fast. The flip side to this is that SMGs are much more easily handled, and it's a lot easier to hit consecutive headshots when you're using an SMG inside its optimal range. So when you're up close to your enemy, the SMG is almost always the better option to be using, whereas if you're further away, the assault rifle is likely going to be your go-to pick. In this way, I very much expect that we'll see a lot of people running with both an assault rifle and an SMG and switch between the two of them depending on their engagement range, which to be honest is pretty damn awesome. So, those are the results. It's looking pretty damn good, to be honest with you. Don't think that SMGs got some big buff, because they didn't. To be perfectly honest, they really didn't need it. Things are now in a very good place and the weapons are very balanced across categories. Now, to wrap things up, I really want to hand over these tools to the community and essentially crowdsource what comes next. With the methodology that I've laid down here, it's going to be really easy for anyone to look at their build configuration, plug it into the spreadsheet, and determine how they could better optimize their DPS. It's also highly likely that the configurations that I've laid out aren't actually the absolute best, even though I've run the numbers pretty comprehensively. My hope is that people will use these tools themselves and combine them with things like gear set bonuses and, named gear, exotic weapons, etc., to develop new calculations based on different gear sets and playstyles, so that we can essentially get to the point where we have a really robust data set that says, cool, if you want to play Striker with an SMG, here are all the stats and talents and stuff that you should be taking to get to the best possible DPS. I've left links to the spreadsheets that I've made and to Spyder's cheat sheet in the description below, and I've also uploaded screenshots of the best SMG and assault rifle configurations so that you can quickly refer back to them whenever you need. I really hope you guys find those things useful. I'll finish by saying that I'm actually really happy with where 1.6 has landed from a stats balance perspective. It's far from perfect, but most balance is typically like that, but removing armor has brought SMGs back into the mix in a very big way, and the changes to FAMAS and to Alpha Bridge has really opened up the weapon meta overall. Last Stand provides us with a really great opportunity to PvP in a more interesting, balanced space that allows us to try out all sorts of interesting build configs that we would otherwise not have done. It's actually a really good time to be playing the game and to be PvPing, and I for one certainly plan to do more PvP than I have in the past. For now, guys, I really hope you liked the video. I know it was long and it was very math heavy, but I really wanted to give you all the details so you can kind of see where it all came from. I really hope you found it useful. If you did, do drop it a like and be sure to subscribe. I've got quite a few 1.6 videos on the way, so I do look forward to those. For now, thanks for watching, take care, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.